I am so honored today to be participating in this conversation with Dr. Alyssa Sepinwall about another work that is changing the field. And so I will say a few words about Dr. Sepinwall. Dr. Alyssa Goldstein Sepinwall is professor of history at California State University, San Marcos. She earned her BA in intellectual history and political philosophy at UPenn and her PhD at Stanford University, where she was a fellow student of Keith Michael Baker. And I'm delighted that Alyssa and I are intellectual sisters through Keith. Dr. Sepinwall is a historian of France and Haiti, as you all know. She has published 3 books. Many of you know her from her outstanding monograph on the Abbé Grégoire and the French Revolution, the making of modern universalism, which first came out with UC Press in 2005 and is now out in paperback. So again, great opportunity to bring that book into your classroom if you haven't already. And we also know her from her edited collection for Routledge, Haitian History, New Perspectives, which came out in 2012. These books are standards for many of our classrooms and PhD reading lists. She has also written numerous standalone articles that you will know, including her important 2010 piece in the Journal of Modern History on Robespierre, the Jacobins and Questions of Gender, and other articles on race, slavery, and memory in France, the Haitian Revolution, Jews and Jewish immigrants in France, world history, and more. At her university, her distinguished research, teaching, and service made her the recipient of the institution's highest awards for faculty, the Brakebill Distinguished Professor Award and the President's Award for Innovation in Teaching. She has served and continues to serve the disciplines of French and Haitian history in multiple ways and across many professional societies, including her current work with H France and the Society for French Historical Studies. In addition to all this, Dr. Sepinwall has long worked to serve the broader public and was featured in The Guardian just 2 days ago on the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. So I would like to, before handing over the mic to you, Alyssa, to thank you. Thank you for your incredible work. If we were in an actual room, I would insist that we applaud right now all that you have given to us. And again, I am truly honored to have this chance to converse with you about your exciting new book, Slave Revolt on Screen, the Haitian Revolution in Film and Video Games, which just came out with the University Press of Mississippi. This book, for those who have not taken a look at it yet, is incredibly rich and compelling. It engages film studies, game studies, ethnology, fan culture, video game and filmmaking across multiple continents and genres, from feature-length films, documentaries, shorts, and animations, films that were made and films that were not. So it's just so great to have this opportunity to chat with you today. So Alyssa, I'm going to turn it over to you for some introductory words on this fantastic book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pichichero, Christy. It is really an honor to have you joining me for this today, especially with you being abroad right now. And I want to thank so much to Sally Charno and Jeff Horn for this wonderful series this year. And also Tip Reagan, the executive director of the Society for French Historical Studies, for thinking in this year, being online, what things can we do to broaden the society's scope and reach? And the theme of this series, focusing on issues of race, has been extremely important. I want to tell you all, we have the cameras off because we were afraid of Zoom bombings at the beginning, but I can see you all. I have my screen, so I see your names. So I'm all grateful that you're all here. And I'm honored that you came today. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about my book. Christy will have some questions and then we'll open it up. So my book is on the Haitian Revolution and on media and video games. And it might sound like I left history and went to media studies, but this is, of course, connected to my larger interest in studying Haiti and its often misunderstood history, as well as in studying the histories of the French Revolution and French colonialism. So for those of you who know my work on the Abbé Grégoire or Haitian historiography, it was probably not obvious to you that I would start writing about Chris Rock the comedian, or about video games. So I want to give you just a brief overview of how I came to be interested in this topic and why it's important to me, where this connects with my previous work, and also some of the major arguments of this. So how I came to be interested. As some of you know, my first book was about the Abbé Grégoire, which, as Christy said, is in paperback now. We have a discount code to share if you're interested. It's very nice. It was $85 and now it can be less than $20, which is great. That book sought to be a history not just of Grégoire, but also a new look at the French Revolution's origins and legacy, and at French universalism and the French Republic's attitude toward diversity. I wanted to get at the root of the modern French state's problem that it has often had dealing with the cultural diversity of its population, especially but not only after post-colonial migrations. So my book was an early entry into the colonial turn in French history. And I'm glad that UC Press is now making it more accessible now that some of these issues have been recognized as more relevant. So since my Grégoire book, I've worked both on France and on Haiti. My second book, as Christy said, was a survey of Haitian history and historiography called Haitian History, New Perspectives, which, since this is an FHS crowd, I published in Jack Sensor's Rethinking History series at Routledge. So where there's a large body of work surveying the historiography of the French Revolution, this was the first book to do so on the historiography of the Haitian Revolution, as well as that of modern Haitian history through the 21st century. So I wrote that book in the wake of the 2010 earthquake because I was troubled by the horrible and misleading narratives circulating on Haiti in foreign media, which often emphasize Haitian poverty without talking about the way that foreign governments, including France and the US, have helped make it that way, even when they're talking about supposedly helping Haiti. So I focused in that book and elsewhere on competing narratives of Haitian history. And I sought to make it easier for people to get up to speed on Haitian history and historiography, both for intrinsic purposes, because it's a field people should know, but also to help spur better policies, since recycling tired narratives about Haiti has led to what the filmmaker Raoul Peck has called fatal assistance that harms people in the guise of helping them. So how did I move then from historiography to film and video? I'm still focusing on these narratives and who gets to shape them and how that affects Haitians today, but moving from texts to visual materials and pop culture. So I first started to think about how French colonialism and national liberation struggles were portrayed on screen as part of my teaching. And then I started to write about film in part by request of H. France. Deanna Vardy asked me to review several films related to Haiti for H. France's publication, Fiction and Film for French Historians. And one of these was the Toussaint Louverture miniseries that aired in 2012 on France 2. France 2. I found that miniseries not just disappointing, but shocking, as I wrote in a review back then. There were some ways in which the miniseries shattered some of the silences in France about the Haitian Revolution that I had been writing about in the mid-2000s. But there were also deeply offensive parts of the film. It applied that slavery was not so bad, that French enslavers were definitely not racist, and that enslaved people were essentially violent ingrates who started a war for no reason. And the miniseries epitomized for me certain flaws in the French memory of slavery, even after the passage of the Taubira Law in 2001, which recognized slavery as a crime against humanity. So shortly after I reviewed that miniseries, a student in my French colonialism class told me that there was a new game coming out on what we are studying, which at that point was slave resistance in Saint-Domingue. And I was skeptical of this. I thought maybe he was confused, as that seemed strange to me, as I had not realized this was the kind of topic that video games treated. But I watched the game trailer he sent, and sure enough, Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry was a game about slave resistance in Saint-Domingue. Given how much the Toussaint Louverture miniseries had whitewashed the history of slavery, I have to say I was pleasantly shocked by the trailer and then the game itself. While it had some anachronisms and things that would never happen, Freedom Cry depicted slavery from enslaved people's perspectives, emphasizing the long resistance to oppression in colonial Haiti and Haitian agency. Unlike the Toussaint Louverture miniseries or some of the historiography I had written about, especially from France, this game did not treat emancipation as a gift to Haitians from white hero abolitionists in the metropole. Instead, the game emphasized Haitian agency and how African descended people had organized to win their own freedom. So the trailer prompted 100 questions for me. How could a game be so many steps ahead of so many films and textbooks? Who were these developers who had built a video game around slave resistance in Saint-Domingue and imbued it with a post-colonial lens? And I also wondered, how was the gaming industry open to storylines that Hollywood studios had been shying away from? So I started writing an article that was comparing the few films I knew about on the Haitian Revolution. Some people think there haven't been any films on the Haitian Revolution, but I knew about a few. So I was going to compare them with this game. But during my sabbatical, which was 2016 to 2017, I discovered so many films and games related to the Haitian Revolution that had not been written about that the article ended up eventually becoming a 10-chapter book. And it was especially important to me to locate films by Haitian filmmakers, even if they're not readily available and even if they're not full length, because full length films are very expensive. And I wanted to find those, if people had to send them to me instead of just streaming what I could find on Netflix or watching things on DVD. So what are some commonalities with this project and my previous work? I remain interested in questions of historiography, comparative memory, and connections between Haiti and France. The book adds to my past work on France's complicated relationship with its colonial and slaveholding past, and also considers U.S. memory on slavery. More theoretically, I approach films and video games from my work as an intellectual and cultural historian. I think about them as texts illustrating popular historical memory, lieu de mémoire, but also different kinds of historiography. So I'm interested, of course, in authorial intention, and I did interviews with filmmakers and game developers, but I'm also interested in the reception and legacy of films and games. So in the book, you'll see I use a range of methodologies from representation analysis to reception history to film analysis influenced by the film historian Robert Rosenstone to post-colonial theory. And I also had to develop a methodology for how to develop historical accuracy in video games. I still do love doing archival intellectual history, so you'll see that in a few chapters, particularly on a Hollywood film that I talk about and on unmade films, Haitian Revolution. I got to use 20th Century Fox archives, as well as those of several white filmmakers and African-American artists who were not able to get their films funded. So let me give you a quick overview before we go to questions. One of the major questions that prompted writing the book is something I've worked on in the past. Why is there less knowledge among the general public about the Haitian Revolution than other revolutions in the late 18th century? Or in Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's words, why has the Haitian Revolution been silenced? So as part of thinking about that question, I realized that I needed to look beyond texts because its absence on screen was one reason, particularly at a time when the general public often learns history more from Hollywood than from historians. So I asked a series of questions. Number one, why hasn't Hollywood made a major epic about the Haitian Revolution when there are scores of films about other revolutions? I discovered many projects proposed by big names that did not get funding because producers thought the story would be unappealing to white audiences. That pointed to the more general question of what is it about this story of Blacks fighting back to win their freedom against colonial oppression rather than waiting peacefully for a white savior that has seemed radioactive to Hollywood. Second, I found some films about the Haitian Revolution that did exist. These include the French Toussaint Louverture miniseries, Burn from Gillo Pontecorvo, who also did Battle of Algiers, and other French dramas and documentaries. I also found this forgotten Hollywood film set during the Haitian Revolution called Lydia Bailey that 20th Century Fox made in 1952, as well as other genres of film. And for these, I asked, how well did French, American, and other foreign directors portray the Haitian Revolution and the French slavery system? Third, I wanted to know, were there films by Haitians about the revolution? And this grows out of the fact that this has always been important to me. When I wrote about Gregoire, I wanted not only to write about his ideas, but to find Jewish and Caribbean intellectuals of his time talking back to him. And in my second book, I didn't write only about North American ideas about Haiti, but also sought to spotlight Haitian perspectives on their history and how they often differ from foreign ones. So for this book, I sought out, as I said, Haitian productions on their own history and was excited to find a number of them and get to interview their creators, even if they're far less well-known and lower budget. And I asked, what does it look like on screen when Haitians get to narrate the story of their own revolution instead of being objects? And finally, with regard to video games, a kind of source that has been almost entirely ignored by historians, let alone on this topic, I asked, why have video game companies been willing to fund games on slave revolt in Haiti or otherwise when film producers won't? And how good is the history of the games? And how should historians approach them? I argue that whatever we might think of video games, they exist. And they're played by millions of players. And then players come to our classes with this history from the games in their mind. So it's vital that we pay attention to them. And this part of the book may be less interesting to you as French historians, but I hope it's one of the things that might make the book important to historians across fields. So I did a podcast on this for the AHR in March. The March 2021 issue of the AHR was the first one ever to feature video games in its articles. So the overall argument of the book concerns the ways that the economic legacies of slavery and colonialism still warp pop culture portrayals of the past and cause harm in the present, because the former colonizers and the former enslavers' descendants still have more power to tell the story on screen than do Haitians. So I just want to show you the table of contents for the book, and then I will take your questions. I'm going to, in just a moment, share my screen. All right, and I'm not going to come out of, I'm not going to put it in, what is it called? Slideshow mode, because that always messes me up when I'm on Zoom. So here's the book. We have a code, and Jeff and Sally will pop it in also. And then this was the first book, and we have a code for that also. And this was Haitian History, New Perspectives. But I wanted to show you the table of contents. So the first section of the book looks at foreign views of the revolution. I have a chapter on the Haitian Revolution in US and primarily French feature films. Then I look at Caribbean feature films that look at the revolution's influence elsewhere in the Caribbean. Chapter 3 is about this wonderful to think film. I have some mixed ideas about it, but it was also made at the time of HUAC and this kind of communist witch hunt. So it's a really fascinating story. Chapter 4 is called No White Hero, No Funding, and that looks at unmade revolution epics. Chapter 5 is about Chris Rock's film Top 5, which does something very similar to what Alyssa Sepinwall and Michel Rove-Trouillot have been doing in terms of looking at silences in public culture outside of Haiti about the revolution. Number 6 is about documentaries, dramatic shorts, and animation, cheaper genres from France and from North America. And then the second part of the book looks at Haitian cinematic perspectives. The third section looks at video games on slavery and the Haitian Revolution. And chapter 9 looks at North American and European games, including Freedom Cry. But chapter 10, I think I will stop the slide share and look at you all again. Chapter 10 is one of my favorite because I was delighted that I was able to find video games instead of just looking at this written by white people who thought that it was cool to make a game about this. I found games by Antillais intellectuals from Martinique, including one young writer named Patrick Chamoiseau working with his friend Muriel Tramy, who was the first Black woman game designer anywhere, as far as historians have found, working on these games in the 1980s, working for a metropolitan company. So that is an overview of the book, and I will be happy to take your questions, and those from Dr. Pichichero.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. That was a fantastic introduction and really gave us a strong sense for the work that has happened, the richness of this book. Once again, I do think that just like the Grégoire book, it was a bit ahead of its time. You're leading the way here with something important, and I really do hope that this is going to. I was thinking about how to build a course just based on this book and on studying these representations, and then also doing some historiography. So we'll talk about that later. But this was really a great intro. It gave a sense, I think, for one of the main questions I wanted to ask you, which was about the structure of the book, which is so illustrative of this analytical perspective and the multi-perspectival dimension that you thought was really essential to allowing us to understand the power dynamics in the creation of and non-creation of some of these films and video games, and also across these different spaces. So what I'd like to ask you about first is, since your research led you to analyze not only the final products, these films and video games themselves, but also the making of many of them, and then those that were unmade. You make some very stark discoveries regarding the unequal division of financing. You alluded to that in your introduction, and then other dynamics behind the scenes that many of us are quite unaware of. Can you tell us a bit more about some of these discoveries and how maybe they tie into the overall argument of the book?
Sure. Thank you so much. So as an intellectual historian and as a Keith Baker student, like my sister, Dr. Pichichero, I'm often focusing on ideas, and there could be an accusation that perhaps I'm not looking, not in this book, but maybe in the past, at material conditions when one just looks at ideas. And it was very clear to me when I started to study film how much the material conditions mattered, because certainly it's harder for Haitian historians in Haiti to get their ideas out to North America than North American historians because of the language issue. But to publish a book is a relatively cheap technology. To make a film is extremely expensive. And so there's a much greater asymmetry of power in who can get to make a film. And you look at these funding centers, Hollywood and Paris. And in France, because culture is so important, the patrimoine is so important to the patrie, there are so many subsidies for filmmakers who wish to make films, which means that there are more French films that are full length, whether documentaries or otherwise, on the Haitian Revolution than Haitians have been able to make directly on the revolution. And certainly Hollywood, right, very wealthy film center. So what happens is that people who wish to make a film on the Haitian Revolution have to go and ask for money. And of course, also documentary filmmakers, we know independent filmmakers often struggle. They do GoFundMes and things like that, but they might have friends who they can hit up for money. And it's going to be much harder in Haiti for people to do that. So independent filmmakers in Haiti struggle much more. So what I found was, if you want to make a Hollywood film, you have to go ask the studio heads particularly if you want to make an epic. And as people like the sociologist Joe Fegan have written, the studio heads are often white men who might think of themselves as liberal, but have very traditional tastes. And when they make films about Black history, they often do it if there's a white hero in whose shoes the audience can imagine themselves, so that they don't take the history on the screen as an attack against them. And because of this, I found all of these failed projects where, from Danny Glover's to others, where filmmakers were asked, where's the white hero? And without one, they weren't interested. And Lydia Bailey, this 1952 film from Fox, I'm able to go into the archives and I can see the producer telling the scriptwriter, we have to focus on the white characters. The Haitians have to be in the background. And so there's this kind of dynamic, which again, where does this discrepancy, this economic discrepancy come from? It comes from the very history I'm talking about. So the fact that Haiti was made to pay an indemnity after enslaved people liberated themselves. And because they have been forced into further poverty by foreign interventions, numerous foreign interventions, including the US, the wealthy former colonial or neo-colonial powers have more power to tell the story on screen. And when they do it, they often do it in ways that minimize Haitian agency. So yes, talking about that economic issue is very important. I could go on this in greater length, but in my book, I give more.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And this is just a reminder, everyone, please do send me your questions in the chat. We have built this security protocol after many terrible Zoom bombing experiences in the past year, especially about issues concerning race, Blackness, and Black feminism, and Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. So in an excess of caution, please do send me your question in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it to Dr. Sepinwall. So while we're waiting, I have lots of questions. Can you tell us a little bit about the world of gaming? This is something that many of us know less about. We are an extremely geeky group, generally speaking, but I don't know how much many of us get into games at this level. So tell us about the games, about the creators, the gamers from Mewilo to Assassin's Creed. I know, Alyssa, that in other fora, you're able to share clips and do a little analysis of video games and also of some films, which we won't be able to do here. So you'll have to kind of be descriptive, but I know there's really interesting things about fantasy, about the Creole language being used. So what can you share with us about that world, which indeed is one that millions and millions of people around the world engage in, and this would be the way they learn about the Haitian Revolution?
Thank you very much. So it's a big question. I'll just start generally talking about historical gaming and then where the Haitian Revolution fits in. Historical video games are a huge industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry. A game like Red Dead Redemption 2, when it came out a few years ago, its opening weekend sales are on the same level or greater as when the Marvel Universe films come out. So these are games that make huge amounts of money. And there are people who really like playing historical games. Historically, games often focus on white male protagonists. So I'll say that in North America, there was an effort starting especially in the 1990s, but then more again in the early 2010s to diversify protagonists and to tell other kinds of stories. There was also, however, a huge backlash against this by white male gamers who did not like this at all. Yes, I could talk more about that, but you can look up Gamergate. So I think it was in this context that we've started to see Haitian revolutionaries appearing in video games. And So it coincides with that. But I'll just talk about these two games, Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, and then I'll jump to the Caribbean games. Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry was prompted by, again, this desire to have more diverse protagonists. There was a game called Assassin's Creed Black Flag, where there was a more minor character who was of African descent named Adewale, and there were a lot of fans who really liked him and wanted him to have his own game. So they made a game. He was a freeman from Trinidad who'd been born into slavery. And in this game, he arrives on Saint-Domingue and sees the continuing resistance that is happening from Maroons and others. And the creator, the lead writer of this game is a woman named Jill Murray from Ubisoft Montreal. She herself is a white woman, but in her family, there are Haitians who have married in. And in general, she just really felt that she wanted to be an ally and to help people feel seen, to make a game that people thought they would never see their history on screen. So she wrote from that perspective. She asked our colleague at the University of Sherbrooke, Jean-Pierre Le Glonec, to be the consultant on the game, just like for Assassin's Creed's French Revolution game, they had asked Jean-Clément Martin from the IHRF to be the consultant. So that, I would say, is the reason that we see the Haitian Revolution showing up in North American games. And that's a narrative that you'll hear if you kind of look into the game world, that there's been more diversity. But I was, again, delighted to find that Caribbean intellectuals had anticipated this turn by decades, when in the late 1980s, long before the Taubira Law, this group of intellectuals from Martinique decided that they were going to make a video game, and then a few of them that honored slavery. So Muriel Tramy is amazing. She is an engineer who was in the metropole, always in male-dominated spaces. And she decided, as the video game technology started to emerge, that she wanted to try making games. And so she's a very important video game creator in France. She made a math educational game, which a certain generation grew up playing in schools. But she also made these two games, Mawillo and Freedom, Rebels in the Darkness, which is interesting. They used an English title for this French game where they highlight slave resistance. And I think it's really important for us to look back at these games and to see what they were trying to do in game code that paralleled or prefigured efforts to remember slavery.
Thank you so much. I'm starting to receive some questions in the chat. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions from Erica Peters and from Tip Reagan about the gaming world. You answered a bit of Erica's question, but she's also wondering if you have a sense that the gamers, those who are playing the games, are aware of the fact that there has been historical consultation, that there is a sort of robust background in some way that they might be engaging with. And Tip is wondering that, knowing that the mega money to be made in the gaming industry, even with the different assumptions about who their market is and what type of historical subjectivity is emphasized, do you see any evidence that Hollywood might change its or that the gaming industry, which seems in some way to already have made that shift, or be making it in some way. But do you see some of that change on the horizon here?
Thank you. Those are wonderful questions from Erica and Tip, and hi to both of you. So one of the things I've learned is that gamers who like historical games, they want to know about the accuracy. The idea that a game is accurate is something that is a selling point for many gamers. So yes, some of them will say, oh yes, that company, they always use historical consultants. I like their games. Because you'll have gamers who'll play a game and then they'll read history. They might not know which one to read, right? They might look on Amazon, or they might be history majors. But this is definitely something that gamers are often looking for and is one of Ubisoft's selling points. Now, the question is, what does accuracy mean, of course? And this is a question that is also something that we can think about when we look at historical film. And here I am Robert Rosenstone stan, as the people say. I've really become a hardcore Rosenstonian. He's a postmodern historian who was one of the leaders in the AHA of getting historians to take film seriously. Instead of just dismissing films and watching a film and saying, wrong, nope. Historians could do that for every film they're watching. And then there would really be no way to decide what's a good historical film and what's a bad one. They would just all be inaccurate. So he developed standards for thinking about that and deciding what kinds of accuracy are more important. So invention of characters or details that might be wrong are not as grave as having a historical narrative that really distorts what happened. So for me, films that minimize Haitian agency or games, because then I applied Rosenstone's ideas to video games, things that have bad narratives or neo-colonialist narratives are worse than something that might get a detail wrong. We can point to a detail and say, no, that wouldn't have happened in the 1730s. That would have been in the 1750s. Or no, Maroons would not have been at the coast because they tried to stay in the mountains. That's different than a film that portrays, like the Toussaint Louverture miniseries, enslaved people as happy until they learn from reading French Enlightenment works that slavery is wrong and they should be ashamed to be enslaved. So that's one of the issues, is this issue of accuracy. Now, might Hollywood change? That is such a wonderful question tip. Yes, certainly that is one thing I hope. There's definitely a reason for skepticism when you have these entrenched structures. And I know we have some sociologists here. So I don't know that the kind of powers that be in Hollywood will immediately change and that there will be different gatekeepers. But when something is shown to be able to make money, that is something that starts to change gatekeepers' point of view. So I talk in the conclusion of the book, for instance, about Black Panther and about these video games, and ask whether this is something that Hollywood might change. But I'll say that more generally, one of the things I argue is that this also needs to be driven by consumers and viewers. If we just stream whatever is on Netflix and we don't demand different content, or we don't buy tickets to film festivals to try to watch things by Haitians, then we're just part of the system in which things are given to us that the gatekeepers want to have. Thank you for those questions.
Thank you so much for those answers. I now have a question coming through from Sue Peabody. And so she says, as we know, it's an enormously complex event, the Haitian Revolution, and now the Haitian Revolution on film. So an enormously complex event with many characters, and drama has certain conventions: protagonist, the quest with the antagonist, rising action, resolution, denouement. So aside from selecting Haitian protagonists, how does the structure of plot affect our understanding of history?
That is a wonderful question. And again, we turned off video for safety reasons, but I see that you're all here, and thank you. And Sue, thank you for that question. This again comes, this is something Rosenstone has talked about a lot in evaluating film. It is inevitable when you're going to take a very complex event, you can't make it into a 100-hour film. It's too expensive and no one wants to watch it. So it has to be compressed and simplified to be at feature film length, or you don't have a story on that. So there are definitely decisions that have to be made. But I think, again, it comes down to what are the narratives that the film is ultimately showing? What sense does it give us of lived experience? For instance, the slave system. Right, we don't need to have violence simulated on screen in the way that sometimes people accuse of being kind of like violent pornography or torture, suffering pornography. We don't necessarily need to see things, but are enslavers portrayed as nice people? As we have in the French Toussaint Louverture miniseries, or do we have, as in Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, people of African descent talking about how cruel and brutal enslavers are and how it's necessary to be free. So that's one example. And I think it is a challenge. It definitely is a challenge to take the story and boil it down. But I think that there are people who have tried to do it and might still be able to. One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I won't say too much now, especially since this is being recorded, but there's a noted Haitian director who had a wonderful script, but it was not made. And I was able, by someone close to the production, to get access to the script. And I thought that it was really terrific, even if things were simplified in matching the kinds of historical perspectives that people like Sue Peabody or others in this Zoom or elsewhere would write about in their.
Great. Thank you so much. The questions are coming in. Thanks, everyone. Keep them coming. So I have a question from Carolyn Eichner, which completely overlaps with one of my burning questions. So of course, I do know the Haitian director that you're talking about, but this person's name shall not be revealed here. You must read the book. And so Carolyn's and my question has to do with gender as it intersects with race. Adding in, I think, the question of violence and also of sexuality, which I think, at least in the world of gaming that I know peripherally, the sort of the woman saving women, the woman as a reward, the gendered and sexualized elements seem really key here, and now in this piece are also intersecting with race and with violence. So can you tell us a bit about what your analyses revealed about this intersection?
Definitely, and thank you, Carolyn, for the question. So I will start maybe with the games by the Caribbean intellectuals from the 1980s, because they were ahead of their time in many ways. And one thing that Muriel Tramy did with Chamoiseau's cooperation was to choose avatars that were men and women. So when you play the game, you play as someone. And in the game Freedom, what happens is that an enslaved person tries to liberate all of his or her colleagues, and whether by burning down the plantation or other means. And it was important to her, despite sometimes the discussion that in France, feminism is a dirty word. For her, she considered herself a militant feminist. And it was important to her that there were women, because in the historical reality, women were contesting their enslavement just as men were. So in that game, we have a real figure from the 18th century named Solitude, who was a woman who fought against slavery in Guadeloupe. And then there's also a fictional woman named Delia. And when I asked Muriel Tramy, because the male avatars are Macandal from Saint-Domingue, or a man named Seychou, who's also a historical figure from Martinique and Chamoiseau has written about. So I said to Muriel Tramy, I know these other three people, but who is Delia? That name is unfamiliar to me. And she said, I am sure that somewhere, parmi les Antilles, there was a Delia who fought against her enslavement. And so that game was completely egalitarian in that way. Now let's jump ahead to the US, where, as Carolyn and your question suggested, gaming has often focused on men, and women appear as sex workers or vixens or as objects. So when I tell you that Assassin's Freedom Cry, the main female character is a madam in a brothel, that might seem just to fit into this pattern. But I will tell you that Jill Murray said, when I spoke to her, that she didn't want to create any more sex workers in games. It's been done so much, she was trying to move away from it. But when she was reading historiography and primary sources about Saint-Domingue to create the game, she discovered a story of a real madam who had so enchanted a French scientist who had come to Saint-Domingue that he upset his whole life for her. He tried to get her this very huge diamond. And so that made Jill Murray think about, how can I think about power and how power would have been exercised in Saint-Domingue? And we certainly know that that really was the case, that women of color on Saint-Domingue used their agency in whatever way they could. And in the game, Bastien Joseph, the madam, we don't see her, performing sexual acts. What we see her doing is extracting information from her white clientele and then feeding it to the people fighting against slavery. So I think that's very important. I'll stop there. I could say more. There's another game that Jill Murray created called Liberation that has a Black female protagonist.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. I think some of us are going to need to go home and play these games. Maybe we'll organize an adult video game play date at SFHS in Charlotte next spring. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to combine here that have to do with aesthetics and with adaptation. So from Judith, there is a question about aesthetic qualities in these films and videos with regard to the level of editing, the types of film shots, musical score. To what extent are these sort of in line with other works that are sort of historical games or historical films? Is there something distinctive aesthetically that you could bring forward with regard to these games and films on the Haitian Revolution? And then from Madeline Doby, she notes that feature films are often developed from novels and other literary forms. As there are a number of novels in several languages that depict the Haitian Revolution. She's wondering if you could speak about the issue of adaptation just a bit more. And I'm curious as well, wearing my hat as a scholar of literature, what extent these novels or plays may have influenced the creation of certain films or games.
Thank you very much to Judith and to Madeline. I'd say the aesthetics is a very big question if we're thinking about visual culture of the films and the games. And I think that, again, because I'm looking at games that are so diverse, both these slick, expensive, right, multi-million-dollar development budgets from North American studios in the 2010s versus these games from the 1980s that at the time they were state-of-the-art using pixel art to create these worlds. Now, of course, they don't look that compelling compared to the other games, but the aesthetics are very different in these games. I will say something about the sound before I move on to Madeline's question. On Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, there's a soundtrack to the game, and I was delighted to discover that someone who had worked on it was a friend of mine. Lois Wilkin is the executive director of La Troupe Macandal in New York, and she told me that she actually had been asked by the company, although they didn't say who it was. They just approached her, said it's a project, and we can't say very much, to get the Haitian musicians to perform on the soundtrack. So she got Monvalino Alexi, who's a very important Haitian Vodou singer who's based in New York, but from Haiti, to record authentic Vodou songs for the soundtrack. They wanted to have that in the game as part of the accuracy, to have authentic music. But these songs ended up getting mixed into the kind of lush Western orchestral scores that we imagine in cinema or in a game. So I had an opportunity to interview Monvalino Alexi, and he appreciated the opportunity to share his culture, but he thought it was strange that they had then done this fusion. Okay, on Madeline Doby's question about novels, yes, I think that would be one possibility if someone wanted to create a film about the Haitian Revolution and also get back at Sue Peabody's question about how do you tell a story that's compelling. So one of my favorite novels on 18th century Haiti is Eveline Trouillot's The Infamous Rosalie. It's a fictional character, but it's an enslaved woman, a young woman imagining what her life is like, living in this brutal system, and trying to think of an alternative future for herself and for the family that she is going to create. So I think that would be a great movie. Just the same way as for the Holocaust, we have films that are based on novels, but that are still showing us something about the historical experience. But I will say that often what people are trying to make are not Madison Smart Bell's All Souls Rising or other novels, but rather biopics, because we still do not have, whereas we have all of these movies on Napoleon, we still have very few biopics. We have the French Toussaint Louverture miniseries, which, as I've said, is wanting. So I know a number of histories that have been optioned. C.L.R. James, Black Jacobins, some British producers announced that they were going to make it. Hasn't happened. There's a certain other, maybe I shouldn't say publicly, a certain other new biography of Toussaint Louverture that's winning awards. I understand that that has been optioned. I looked at some other projects that were based on other history. So that seems to be what people are trying to do first.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you all for these questions. We've just got 2 more minutes here. And so I've got a question from Erica Peters, and it's also something I think that is going through people's minds right now this week. And I mentioned previously that you were featured in The Guardian just on Friday regarding the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. So from Erica Peters and myself and perhaps others here, how does your research regarding different perspectives on the Haitian Revolution, these foreign gazes onto Haiti, how does this help us to unpack reactions to recent current events?
Thank you, Christy. It's been a very hard and sad week. I have friends in Haiti that I'm speaking to, and North Americans often talk about Haiti symbolically, first Black Republic, but Haitians are living this legacy every day, and in many ways, not just the chasm between the ideals of 1804 and now, but also the continuing ways that the international community has sought to punish and isolate Haiti in the wake of the revolution, as there was this fear that if Haiti was successful, that enslaved people elsewhere would rise up. And what's happening right now with the assassination, news is changing all of the time. And I certainly have talked in The Guardian and did a TV appearance the other day for Russian television about different possibilities of who did this. But the real issue, I think, is that the international community has not really let Haitians have real democracy or real sovereignty. So after the earthquake, Haitians had ideas for rebuilding themselves. And instead, you had foreigners, the UN, Bill Clinton, who was appointed to be head of this interim reconstruction committee, Sean Penn, who somehow managed to have enough power to be able to tell the president of Haiti what he thought needed to be done and it needed to be done now. People were able to do things that, as Raoul Peck has said, were fatal assistance. And I will say that we also meddled in the elections that brought this party, the PHTK, to power, because often powerful business interests in the US and elsewhere are lobbying and shaping our foreign policy when the rest of us are not paying attention or when our voices don't matter. And so there's just been a history that when a Haitian politician tries to get a minimum wage passed, even to be a very tiny amount by our standards, we do not want that to happen because the American garment companies that have sweatshops in Haiti say that it will cost their business too much. And there's pressure put on the politicians to cancel that, or guess what? They send a limo for it. So I think that we're seeing this horrible power struggle right now within the dissent, I'm thinking in French, within the PHTK party. But we are the ones who helped push them into power, I am sorry to say, and you break it, you bought it. That doesn't mean we should send troops, though. Foreign interventions often have the effect of making things worse. The UN troops not only raped Haitian women and men, but also brought cholera, which the UN has not taken accountability from. And I will say that my Haitian filmmaker colleagues, these are the conditions they work in. They work in a situation in which it can be dangerous for them. The Republic of NGOs, I don't have time to go through this, but has created a condition in which there may be 1,000 orphanages and no fire trucks, because fire trucks are not sexy for foreign donors, and foreign donors are able to kind of run rampant over the Haitian state. And so I think that the issues that are playing out so terribly right now are connected to these longer term issues that I look at in history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alyssa Sepinwall, for this fantastic conversation, for this important work, for helping us to think about the ways in which this past and interpretations of this past, representations of it, are continuing to play out, color the way we think, and how we as historians can bring to bear our knowledge and our analytical background to help others around us see more clearly the invisible hand at work behind so much of this. So thank you again. Congratulations on this book. I can't wait to talk to you about building a syllabus. And thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again to the Society for French Historical Studies, to Jeff and to Sally. And do take care, everyone. We look forward to seeing you all very soon.